In the midst of the federal government's ongoing trade dispute with China, a new Angus Reid Institute survey suggests Canadians are in favor of cutting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to try and secure Canada's canola industry. Sierra D'Souza Butts has the details.
Washington just suffered the trade blow it feared most. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing to end the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. A move that could rip apart Trump's entire tariff empire and expose how little control America really has over global trade. If Canada defects, China's EV giants won't just enter North America, they'll dominate it, leaving U.S. policy in the dust. To understand why Canada is preparing to end its 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, we need to go back to the roots of the trade war. It started in 2018 when Donald Trump launched a wave of tariffs on Chinese goods, claiming they were needed to protect American jobs and industries. That aggressive strategy didn't just reshape U.S.-China relations, it pressured allies to follow suit. Under intense political and economic pressure from Washington, Canada joined the campaign to slow China's rapid expansion in high-tech sectors. In October 2024, Ottawa imposed a sweeping 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles, presenting it as a shield to protect its struggling auto industry. Beijing responded swiftly and painfully. It hit back with a 75.8% tariff on Canadian canola and other farm products. China imposes preliminary 75.8% anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola, targeting the country's most vital export sectors. Suddenly, the policy meant to protect one industry was destroying another. Farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta saw billions in export revenue vanish and warehouses filled with unsold crops. At the same time, automakers gained no real advantage as supply chains became more expensive and EV adoption slowed. What began as a show of unity with Washington quickly turned into a domestic crisis for Ottawa. The reality became clear. Canada was sacrificing its economy to fight America's trade war. By 2025, with political pressure mounting and economic losses growing, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team began to question whether following the U.S. lead was worth the cost. That's when talk of reversing the tariff wall first began. Not as a bold new vision, but as a desperate attempt to fix a mistake born in Washington. The impact of Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles quickly spiraled into a nationwide crisis. What was meant to protect domestic car makers ended up hurting them instead. By mid-2025, electric vehicle sales had collapsed by almost 35.2% year-on-year. Consumers walked away as prices soared and incentives vanished, with provinces like British Columbia ending rebate programs and Quebec barely keeping its own alive after public anger. Dealerships were left with unsold inventory, and manufacturers scaled back production as costs rose. Meanwhile, farmers faced an even harsher reality. China's retaliatory tariffs slammed the door on Canadian canola, peas, and other exports, hitting the country's most vital trade sectors. Exports to China were roughly Canadian $5 billion in 2024, and futures prices plunged about 6.5% after the tariff announcement. Thousands of jobs in rural communities were suddenly at risk, and frustration boiled over at town halls and protests across the prairie provinces. Business leaders warned that Ottawa's policy was strangling growth, and economists described the trade war as self-inflicted economic damage. As pressure mounted from automakers, farmers, and provincial governments, it became clear that the country could not continue down this path. Canada's economy was bleeding on two fronts, industry and agriculture, and the political cost was rising just as fast as the economic one. What began as a show of strength against China had turned into a battle Canada was losing at home. As the pressure on Canada's economy intensified, Prime Minister Mark Carney knew that holding the 100% tariff line was no longer sustainable. The policy that was once sold as a bold defense of Canadian industry had turned into a political and economic liability. Behind closed doors, Ottawa began quietly exploring ways to de-escalate the trade war without appearing weak. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made a surprise visit to Beijing, signaling a new willingness to engage directly with China. Instead of criticism, his move was praised by business groups and even received public thanks from Carney himself, a clear sign that Canada's stance was shifting. Foreign Minister Melanie Joy cautiously admitted the tariff was now under review, and officials floated the idea of diversifying trade with partners like Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. At the same time, Canadian negotiators opened discreet talks with Chinese counterparts, exploring deals that would exchange tariff relief for investment in Canadian auto manufacturing. Agriculture officials pushed for market access guarantees for canola and other key exports. This new approach marked a significant departure from the confrontational strategy of 2024. Ottawa was now looking for leverage, not just resistance. Analysts describe the shift as pragmatic realism, a recognition that Canada needed China as much as China needed Canadian resources. The focus had been moved from proving loyalty to Washington to protecting Canada's own national interests. What began as a rigid trade wall was slowly turning into a bridge, built on diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic compromise. For years, Washington believed that a united Western front could slow down China's rise in technology, manufacturing, and clean energy. But Canada's shift away from the 100% EV tariff is now threatening to break that alliance apart. If Ottawa ends its trade barriers, it will not just be an economic decision, it will be a political message that U.S. pressure no longer dictates global trade policy. Canada's defection could inspire other nations, including Germany, Australia, and even Japan, to rethink their own restrictions on Chinese products. This would open the floodgates for Chinese electric vehicles, which already dominate more than 60% of the global battery supply chain. America's attempts to isolate Chinese technology are now being undermined by its closest allies. The White House fears that once Canada breaks ranks, its entire tariff strategy will unravel, leaving U.S. automakers exposed to intense competition from companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng. Even worse, Chinese firms are already seeking to build factories in North America, meaning they could soon bypass tariffs entirely. What began as Washington's plan to contain Beijing is turning into a strategic failure, one that could shift the balance of economic power across the West. If Canada removes the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, the consequences will reach far beyond its borders. Cheaper, technology-packed Chinese electric vehicles will flood the Canadian market, driving down prices and forcing North American automakers to compete harder than ever. Consumers could benefit from more choices and lower costs, but domestic car companies already under pressure may face major losses or be pushed to relocate production. Canada's farmers, on the other hand, would see a huge turnaround. Billions in lost agricultural exports could return almost overnight if Beijing reopens its market to canola, peas, and other products. However, Washington might retaliate with new trade barriers of its own, raising tensions between the two allies. Analysts warn that such a move could deepen divisions inside the G7 and accelerate a global shift toward multipolar trade alliances. Meanwhile, Chinese companies could use their new access to North America as a springboard to expand even further into Western markets. This would weaken the impact of U.S. sanctions and give Beijing greater influence over future supply chains. What started as a Canadian policy debate is now a test of power between two economic systems, and how Ottawa acts next could redefine the future of global trade. Canada's possible decision to end the 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles is more than a trade policy shift. It's a signal that America's control over the global economic order is starting to weaken. Washington spent years building an alliance of nations to isolate China's technology and slow its rise, but that strategy is now showing deep cracks. If Ottawa abandons the tariff wall, it would mark one of the most serious breaks in that alliance to date. The consequences would ripple far beyond Canada's borders. It would show that countries are no longer willing to damage their own economies just to support U.S. political goals. The question now is not whether China will grow stronger, but how quickly U.S. dominance will erode, and how many allies will follow Canada's lead. Canada's decision could mark the beginning of the end for America's trade dominance, proving that tariffs and pressure can't stop global power shifts. Subscribe for more deep dives into how these moves are reshaping the world economy.